Dollars to Donuts with your host, Steve Portugal.
Welcome to Dollars to Donuts, the podcast where I talk with the people who lead user research in their organization. I read recently about a new genre of TikTok videos that feature people applying makeup while lip-syncing to stand-up comedy routines by John Mulaney. I believe that TikTok has its roots as a platform for lip-sync performances, and of course makeup tutorials and demonstrations are their own thing on the internet. But how do we end up with the combination? And not just one, but a whole series. How did this come about? Why are people doing it? And are there other niche subgenres or patterns that this relates to? Even if we're tempted to dismiss these behaviors as just a bunch of people being weird, we need to be doing the research to understand how and why this is happening. Sure, people at TikTok should know how people are using their service. But insight about this is also valuable to other platforms like YouTube and Twitter and Instagram. How could this information give you a new perspective on user behaviors if you work at Dropbox? Or if you work for Michelin, either their travel department or their tire division? How could Nationwide Insurance make use of this? Our culture swerves and leaps, and when these emergent behaviors poke their head up through into the mainstream, it's an invitation to take note and to be curious. And this is what clients hire me to do, whether it's to be the one that leads the investigation to unlock the motivations and desires of current and prospective customers, or to be someone who helps their team as they themselves dig into the hidden behaviors and objectives of users. I help companies look at their own organization, their culture, and their processes to help set the stage for this kind of discovery work to flourish and have impact. If you're a fan of this podcast, then remember you can support the podcast by supporting me and my practice. Please reach out to me at portugal.com and let's find a way to work together. Okay, it's time for my interview with Amber Lindholm. She's the head of design research at Duo Security. Well, Amber, thank you for being on Dollars to Donuts. It's really great to get to speak with you.
Hey, Steve. It's great to be here.
Hey, I guess I should have said hey. Hey, Amber. So
Hey.
I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself.
So I'm Amber Lindholm. I'm currently the head of design research at Duo Security, which is part of Cisco. And my background is in design, both kind of traditional print design, moving into interaction design, and then design research, which I practiced before, moving into more leadership positions.
What does Duo Security do?
Duo Security, we provide various security products that help protect our customers, basically access to data. So our core product is a multi-factor authentication product. So when you're going to, let's say, log into, a tool that you use at work, after you do your password, you get some sort of maybe a push notification or something that verifies that it's you. So we help protect organizations and their data as well as individuals.
So if I am a consumer and I go to my bank and they said, we're going to send you a text message to prove that you're you before we can let you access your account. Is that the kind of tools that you're providing?
Yeah, that's a great example. A lot of folks are familiar with this through like financial institutions. And we basically have created a product that's super easy for organizations to roll out and get folks enrolled in. But it does that where it's verifying through a second method that you are actually who you say you are.
Eventually, let's get to talk more about the work that you are doing at Duo Security. But since you said a little bit about some of what your background was, it'd be great to just hear more about, like you mentioned, print design. So what's kind of the arc or the history for you from when you got into figuring out your profession to, how you moved to where you are now?
So I started out, as I was mentioning, in graphic design. So I was trained, I went to University of Illinois. We did really kind of what I would call more classical, like Bauhaus, educational style learning, all about formal typography and form and color. And so after school, I followed that path. I found work with a PR agency at first, and then in-house at a nonprofit called Rotary International. And this was up in Chicago. And I spent my time, designing brochures, reports, invitations, billboards, all kinds of print materials. And during that time, I just remember there was this particular project I was working on where we translated most of our materials into 9 languages. So it was going out around the world. And I was creating these, they were kind of these little packets that had a CD that had files for the different Rotary clubs to produce their own kind of marketing materials. And I worked with the translators to, translate the copy on the files and the file names. But after that, I really didn't know when those things were sent out in the world, if they were going to be used properly, if they were going to meet their needs or expectations. And at that time, I started searching around and trying to think, I feel like something's missing. And I came across, the terminology then was human-centered design. And it was just a revelation for me. It seemed like, you can create these things, but if you don't understand how people are going to use them and what they need, you're really going to miss the mark. So that was a catalyst for me to continue my education. So I found a grad program at Institute of Design in Chicago, where I went and I learned, how to do research. They taught all about human factors, all kinds of approaches pulled from social sciences, very qualitative in nature. I learned about design strategy. I learned more about interaction design. And that was really, I really felt like I found my sweet spot. I loved the research side of it. I loved going out and talking to people and trying to understand, who they are and how they behave and why. So when I graduated, actually right before I graduated, I did a couple of things. So one of the things was I wanted to do a little bit of living abroad. So I went for a year to New Zealand and I worked inside the government there. So did a project it was more like a service design, customer experience project, which was really great. It was neat to get that government experience. Came back and my husband and I moved to Austin, just sight unseen, moved down here and have had a couple of different jobs here in Austin. I started out at Frog and I was still mostly focused on design. I was doing interaction design, like mobile tablet type design. But then I started adding in the research projects and that again really flourished there and loved doing that work. Got to do some research in China and other places. And this was more contextual work, like going in people's homes, spending a lot of time with them to understand their world. And a couple other things I did after that. I went and worked in healthcare for a year, trying to do similar kind of research, understanding. For instance, I did a project about the new parent experience. And then I went back to consulting to a consultancy called Project 202. So spent, quite a few years actually being more of a consultant role, working across many industries, which was fun, and started leading a team at Project 202, research and insights team. So we would work on, tons of projects looking at really large customer journeys. And then after consulting for so long, I decided that I wanted to really understand the other side. So to go more in-house, to work at a product company. So I worked at Atlassian and led a design and research team for a product called Stride, which is a video and chat tool. And then I moved to Duo, where I'm at now. And again, I lead the research team there. Love helping our team grow. Love the side of research that really has an impact and provides value. So that's kind of my story.
Talk about, so there's two sort of vectors that I hear. One is in-house and consulting as different perspectives, but you've also talked about research and design. And it sounds like over the course of your career, your title at least has, well, I guess you also said some of the work you're doing might lean more heavily towards one or the other. It's hard to ask the question in an open-ended way as I want to, so I'll just try the leading version. We think of research and design like they're different words. We call them different things. Sometimes they're different kind of career paths. But one of the threads of your narrative that is compelling to me is that you've kind of worked with both those pieces of research and design. I guess I'm wondering, when you think about, for yourself at least, and where you're contributing, where you're adding value, or how you put all these pieces together, what's the relationship between the kind of the R word research and the D word design in your makeup and your skill set?
I think they really complement each other. I think it makes me, as a designer, it made me a stronger designer to have that, research mind. And as a researcher, it made me stronger because I could really make sure that the research I was doing was framed around and presented in a way that provided information relevant to the folks having to make decisions. So I always think about that. It's like when we're trying to figure out what to research and what to prioritize, there's always a whole set of questions. And there are decisions that are having to be made that some are more ambiguous questions where you really don't have a lot of information. Some are really high risk questions. So you want to make sure you're understanding those and providing that information because people are having to make big decisions and tactical decisions, and thinking about how you frame that research and present it back to folks or include them in that process is really important. So I think understanding how designers work and also, now knowing how product companies work understanding the questions that product managers are trying to answer, engineers are trying to answer, and helping them actually articulate those questions is something that I strive to do. So I think they just really complement each other.
The way you describe how you want to make sure that the research you do connects and supports, I hear an echo of your brochure project where you wanted that context to make sure that you knew that the work you were doing was going to have the outcomes and have the results. It sounds very similar. That kind of questioning of, hey, who's doing what and how do we make sure that we help them do what they're going to do? That applies to your quote users as well as your quote stakeholders or colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely. We spend a lot of time, like when I'm working with the researchers on my team and we're looking at a new project, or we're looking across the projects that we could support over a quarter or whatever it is, we're looking exactly at that. Like, where can we have the most impact? Where's the greatest need? Sometimes we're looking at, is there a new project spinning up? Is there a new product manager coming in? Is there, a team that's just starting out that's never gone through this process before? We really like to prioritize those kind of things as well so that we help get them off on the right foot so that they do frame those questions really well. We help show them a good process to follow. And those are really, really fruitful projects.
What's the split between proactive, you identifying what research you want to do versus something that's more reactive where there's requests coming in, hey, can you help us do this?
That's interesting to try to assess out. I think it's a little bit hard because so at Duo, we're part of the product design team. So there's about 30 folks on that team. Research team, I have 4 researchers on the team and a research coordinator who helps do, all of our recruiting and scheduling and all kinds of ops stuff. And so none of the researchers are dedicated to a particular product because Duo does have multiple products. We kind of stay as a little bit of a hub, but we start to embed, like I was saying, okay, let's kind of embed over here on this team. Let's embed on this team for this particular project or this time span. And so the researchers are communicating with the designers. I'm communicating with the design managers and product managers to learn, what their roadmap looks like or what kind of questions they have coming up. So I end up really driving the prioritization of the work we're doing based on all those conversations, looking at the priorities of the business and, kind of larger trajectory of where the business is going and make the decisions of like where we can actually prioritize our time and where we're going to have the most impact. But we do also get requests. So we work with folks outside of the kind of R&D process as well. We've been working with our creative team on website design. We've been working with technical communications folks in our knowledge community. So those people will come to us with requests. We hold office hours every Monday. So sometimes we'll just provide some support or advice or kind of review things. And other times we'll decide to take on a full project.
Can you maybe rewind a little bit and talk about how you came to Duo and what was research like there? Maybe what was the context that was established when you joined and what some of the progress and evolution has been since you've been leading the team?
So Duo, I guess the design team was formed about 5 years ago. And so Sally Carson's our head of design. So she was hired to come in and, build up this team. And really early on, she wanted to make sure that research was part of it. So maybe the second or third hire was a researcher, and his name's Mark Thompson-Kohler. He's still with the team, and he came in. And at that point, because design was so new and research was so new, the focus was, on really rapid usability testing, right? So every 2 weeks, we're going to do testing. We've got people, what do you want to test? And so the company was a startup. It was a lot smaller. And the idea was just sort of this rapid, more evaluative type research. And that went on for a while. And then the team, Mark developed a set of personas that got embedded across the entire Duo organization. As the team continued to grow, it was still kind of like a one-person research shop. Duo, the way the design team has grown, though, designers are hired that also have an interest and skill set in research. So designers also do research. When I came in, another researcher had been hired. So there were 2 researchers and there wasn't what you would call a research team yet. So when I came in, we decided, okay, let's sit down and really talk about, who we are, what's our mission, what's our value, what are the strengths that we have going for us and the gaps and how do we want to move this team forward. And we did, some kind of offsite exercises and that kind of thing. And we started at basics. So there was a ton of knowledge. There was a ton of things that had been done. And we're like, let's make sure like we have it, right? So that first quarter was a lot of pull it together in a place where people can find all of the research that's been done, document some of the tools and templates we have so that other people, on the team can use this stuff. And then we wanted to make sure that instead of just focusing on the evaluative work, we were allowing the designers to really pick up a lot of that and that we could move into more foundational kind of generative type research projects. And so that's what we did after that first quarter, getting all those foundations in place, doing some additional trainings with the design team. The researchers then were able to focus on these more larger, more strategic type research projects. And then we added in research ops. We hired a research coordinator to help us so that the researchers weren't spending, half their time coordinating, recruiting, maintaining our database of participants and all of that good stuff. So she came in last summer. Her name's Annie, and she's been just a fantastic value to the whole team. And then I hired 2 more researchers this spring. And now everyone, sort of has their own area that they're working on right now. And it's been great. It's just been fantastic.
You're describing something that I think is a pattern in a lot of organizations that give the designers the tools to do some of the evaluative work and, a shift in what the research team itself specializes in. What's been the outcome for the designers or the design work that they're doing as you've empowered them to do that evaluative work?
I think it's great. I mean, I think rather than, us being like, no, we can't help you and no, those questions aren't going to get answered, the designers do have the tool set available. And we, depending on somebody's comfort level or, how much they've done this in the past, will provide more or less support, right? So like I said, it's kind of like reviewing the plans, reviewing the script, doing test runs. Maybe we'll moderate a session and then they pick it up after that. Or some folks, they've done this many times and they can run more fully. But they are the experts in sort of this area that they're working on. And they have the relationship with their product manager and their engineers, and they can take all of that, directly back into the work that they're doing. So I think it's great. I always have some hesitancy if it's the subjectivity that might come out of somebody who's testing, their own work. So we do kind of, talk about that, keep an eye out for that. But so far, like it's been great and allowed our researchers to, like I said, focus on not just like those larger research projects, but a researcher on my team, Liz Donovan, right now is helping kind of consult across 6 or 7 teams for this larger project. And so she has really good line of sight around the different questions being asked and helping people, make sure that they're all kind of sharing the insights they're learning across those teams. So it's allowed us to really level up our scope of influence.
That's a great explanation. And I feel like there's an implicit value judgment around what kind of research is cool and fun and worth our time. And that if we can offload some of these tasks to the lower value tasks to other people, then we can work on the cool stuff. Not that anyone has ever said that, but it feels like that's lurking underneath this move to kind of, empower people to do the evaluative work. But I think what I'm hearing from you is in a lot of ways, those people are better positioned to do that work because they're very close to the problem and they can kind of zoom in on how they can get the most actionable results and do so maybe more quickly. And that research, I think your point about having influence. So the work that you're doing is more around the organization and more strategic. And that's kind of what you're positioned to do.
Yeah. So besides, helping bring those designers together, Liz is helping to align PMs as well, or kind of like share across PMs. And she's running a set of like metrics workshops across those teams, created a standard sort of workshop to help us define UX metrics, look for signals and define those metrics. And so she's bringing those to each of those teams. So now, again, it's a more kind of strategic view across those, but then we're still able to weigh in on and influence the type of research, the type of questions, and even the synthesis of the research that's happening across those teams.
What are some other things that you're doing to, whether it's around influence or, kind of bringing the customers into the organization?
When we set out on our kind of mission and the things that we do, obviously sort of like executing and running this kind of product focused or foundational focused research is really important. But sort of the other half of it that we wanted to make clear about was like our role in helping to get folks closer to the customer, to bring that context to them, to keep the customer top of mind. And at Duo, frankly, it's pretty easy because the organization across the board is extremely customer centric. We're not like begging for people to listen to us. The value of research is really understood. It's asked for, actually. Like, people are really interested in hearing more about the context. Our PMs, they're fantastic. They're out there. They do tons of customer calls, but there's still, as we've continued to grow, the risk that we identified is a couple of things. Like, early on, I mentioned that there was a set of personas that were created, and these get referred to all the time across the board in big meetings, big all hands and all of that. Salespeople reference them, our customer success people reference them. But as people join the company, as we were kind of in hyper growth mode, the real deep understanding of those personas may not have persisted, right? So we wanted to take a step back and say, how do we as a research team help other folks have the type of context that we have? So Mark, who developed the personas, we have a program set up where, as new hires come in, he presents something called Personas 101 to make sure that those are really top of mind and understood. And we do a deep dive session on one of the more key personas. He also does something called these fireside chats. So we just chat with different folks. So for instance, different IT administrators or help desk managers or help desk folks or CISOs. We'll set up, an hour-long chat to just learn about their day. And that's open invitation for folks to listen in on. And then we also, with all of our research sessions and things, they're open for folks to come and listen to. So it's very much accessible. We have a research calendar everyone can see, and they can pop in on different things. And lots of folks take advantage of that. And then I think another thing that we wanted to do was make sure that we had created additional sort of artifacts and frameworks for people to think about when they're making decisions. So we took all this data that had been collected over across, about 4 years of tests and interviews and ran these large workshops. And Mark, synthesized all that information into a set of design principles that are persona specific. So they're not these like really super high level principles that are hard to make decisions with. They're very applicable to making, decisions on UI, on making decisions on copy you might be creating. And so those principles are referenced by, designers. They're used in critique sessions. They're referenced by product managers as they're talking about their roadmaps, folks like technical communications and things like that. So the personas and the principles, they're not just an artifact that just kind of sits on the table. We bring them to the forefront in a lot of different ways.
Could you genericize one of the principles just to give a sense of the granularity of it?
Yeah. So for our IT administrators, for instance, one of the principles is around the ability to take action. And so anytime we're making a decision about something in our UI or a flow, if there's a dead end that person cannot actually, let's say they're seeing some kind of thing that may alert them to a security problem. If they cannot immediately take action on that item, then we're not meeting that principle. It's very important for folks to be able to move from information that they're seeing directly into action. And then like for our end users, one of our principles is reduce friction to the extreme. So we're not in the kind of product where, you're trying to create a sticky situation or someone's in your product. You're trying to actually minimize their interaction with your product, because what they're actually trying to do is get into their work application. So we think a lot about that. Like, how do we reduce friction to that extreme?
So those are specific, as you said, and meant to be actionable.
Yeah.
And how many principles in a project like this, how many principles should one be trying to come up with?
Oh, what a question, Steve. I think we narrowed it down to 5 principles for our 2 main personas. And that I think is a good number. Like 3 is too few, 8's too many kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. But 5 has been like the perfect number. And when we first rolled these out, we did some fun things too, where we created some really neat posters that we put out in all the offices. We socialized them with people. We brought them around to meetings. We personified the principles even, which was really fun. But yeah, I think you can't have too many.
How do you personify a principal?
So one of the designers on our team named Andrea actually came up with this idea to, get designers more familiar with all of these. And so each of the principles, one of us was given, and you had to basically just act like that principal. So we had to create a character, and in this sort of mock critique, we had to just care about that particular principle. So it's actually ended up to be quite fun to do.
It sounds like a good improv game.
It was very fun.
Just going back to one of the points you made was that this is an organizational culture that believes in research and, as you said, asks for research. Do you have any perspective on, for Duo, how that came to be?
I imagine it's a couple of different factors. I mean, I think that the folks, Doug and Jono, who co-founded the company, that was like a big thing. Like they really cared about the end user experience. They cared about creating a company that was different than the other security companies out there at the time. Their whole mission is about democratizing security. So making it easy and effective was there from the beginning. And it wasn't just, something they were saying. It was something they really believed in. They saw how complicated, so many security products were. And they wanted to make sure that when these products are out there and it's, an IT administrator, it's not somebody with, a cybersecurity background or anything, that these more generalist folks can protect their organization. So I do think a lot of it came from the founders and then the folks that they hired. So like our head of engineering, Chester, who product design actually reports up through engineering, he's completely supportive of design. We hire engineers that have that kind of mindset also of like customer experience. So I think it just kind of permeates through the culture.
And as you said, starts at the beginning and starts at the top.
I think so. I mean, that's just my impression. I mean, I wasn't there at the beginning, but I see that legacy and I see that through the people that were hired on that continued to be in leadership.
I have so many interactions in so many different venues where somebody who maybe is at an individual contributor level sees that their culture is not like the one that you're describing, and they're being blocked in a lot of different ways. And their question is often like, well, what can I do to succeed this way when these things are kind of arrayed against me? I don't know if you've encountered that or heard that question. I find it challenging to give them super actionable advice when I feel like you're describing, hey, it starts at the top. This is how this company was founded.
Yeah.
They've grown and hired in support of that. And if you're in a situation where that hasn't happened, it's an interesting challenge for people that aren't embedded in those kinds of organizations to make those kinds of changes and advocate for that.
Yeah, I think especially like to your point, if you're not at a leadership level where you have if your scope of influence is just with your immediate project team, it's going to be really hard to sort of like level that up through the organization.
You've named some of the people on your team and the kinds of contributions they've made. And I'm just wondering how you think about, and I think you said you hired 2 people not that long ago to join the team.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you describe a little bit about your approach to finding people, what that looks like in terms of seeing, hey, this is someone that would fit with our organization?
We have probably what's a fairly standard interview process, but I'll just describe that and then sort of what kind of questions I'm asking and looking for. But I typically, reach out to folks. I have like an initial conversation with them just to understand what they're looking for in an organization or what their kind of career goals are, just to make sure it aligns with, the kind of role we have open. Then we do a longer interview, and we use, again, pretty standard like behavioral interview questions to ask people to describe real scenarios. So behavioral interviewing, it's kind of like doing user research or like doing design research, where you're really trying to get somebody to give you very specific real examples, like to tell a story, because you want to understand what the situation was, how they thought about it, and how they reacted to it, versus like a generalized answer. So we follow that. I put together like a set of questions. And then once folks kind of go through that, they go into like a 2-hour, we do a bit of a portfolio review. And then a final round interview is more like a 4-hour thing. And we have designers in there. We have PMs come in, sometimes engineering managers. So different folks who they might, interact with in their day-to-day participate in that more long kind of final interview. But some of the things that I'm always looking out for, like obviously, that they can do the work, but the way that they present the work is really important. So, coming from a consulting background and design background, I do put a lot of emphasis on how people share their work and how clear it is and how compelling it is. How do they tie that story together? How do they tell high level insights, but get into enough details to really support and paint the picture of why that insight matters? So that's a big part of it. And then with the behavioral interview questions, I'm always looking at, can someone learn from a situation? Like, can they, I don't want to say like admit they're wrong, but if they encountered something where it went wrong, how did they go about learning, growing, and kind of improving for the next time? I'm also looking at people that are willing to ask questions. So I really love hearing the questions. I always leave a lot of time for folks to ask me questions. So do they have really good questions? What are the kind of topics they're thinking about? Are they people who are going to come into an organization and be really curious and willing to ask people questions and not just kind of sit and be scared if they don't know the answer? I'm trying to think what else. We ask questions, around working in diverse teams. That's really important to us, and just how they kind of collaborate and work with others.
Yeah, I want to ask about one of the things you mentioned, telling a story about an insight and help it come to life. And you've worked in consulting, so you've experienced some version of this, I think. I mean, in some ways, I think I've grappled with this for much of my career, that there are things that happen over the course of a project that are galvanizing, that just change everything. But to tell somebody else outside that organization, that's a harder story to tell. So I'm wondering, what are the best practices for that? How do I make a story about an experience I had in the past come to life for an audience that didn't have the assumptions, the biases, the worries, all the sort of things that make it so impactful? How do I help somebody else understand that part of the insight?
Well, so what you just said is exactly what I would expect, is that, folks that know how to tell a story up front, they give me enough context about the organization or the problem or the assumptions that were there in the beginning and what kind of impact their research had, and setting the stage of that context. It's not just about the project, right? Exactly what you're saying. Like, every single organization is unique. Every single set of people has different assumptions about things. The challenges that someone might be up against within that organization are going to be different. So a really good researcher is going to help you understand that context of why the thing that they're telling you matters. I think that's the sign of a really good researcher, is that it can never just be about, research for research's sake. Like, this is a cool project. This is a neat thing. I really want to, go in depth and understand perceptions of XYZ with these people. If you don't have that ability to understand the organizational and business context and the types of decisions that are having to be made every day by the rest of the folks in your organization, your research isn't going to have an impact. And so I really listen for that in interviews. Are people able to help me understand how they made an impact and how they understand that larger ecosystem that they're working in?
So back to the archetype I was describing, the person that approaches me, and I think all of us, with, here's why I'm unable to have impact. Here's how my culture just doesn't support me. If that person comes in to speak to your team and tell stories about the research they've done, how do they highlight the impact of their research when there's forces arrayed against them to have that impact?
Yeah, I think that is a really challenging, and I have had interviews where folks have revealed some of those more negative challenges. I would say, like, it can sometimes feel like a person puts up all the barriers and just says, like, I couldn't really do anything, versus somebody saying, like, this was the situation. This is how I tried to take my work and have influence at the level I could influence, right? So, maybe it's getting the one person to shift their perspective and get them to, like, listen in on the interview. I don't know. Whatever that small measure of change or influence is, I think focusing on that is better than just saying, there's all these constraints and I couldn't do anything.
That's good. I'm going to use all these. Because we're always doing storytelling. And I think, and just to kind of reflect on how we can most effectively communicate, overcoming challenges, having success at different levels, all that context.
Yeah.
I think is a really good way of putting it. What are you seeing in terms of where people are coming from to research?
Maybe it's helpful to describe, like, the folks on my team, just because that's, who I'm interacting with. So one of them was actually in journalism for most of his career before transitioning into user experience research. One of them was working in academia for a while, doing all kinds of different unrelated, research around philosophy and other things, and then transitioned into technology, actually, being a technology director for, again, a publication before transitioning into user research. One was a designer before making a transition, and one of them was actually doing market research for consumer packaged goods companies. So all of them had career changes before coming into the research side, which is interesting.
Would you include yourself under that umbrella?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's just a fascinating artifact of what makes up our field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I have an intern coming this summer, and she, again, was more, she's been in the writing field. So she's been a professor, like an English professor, and now working on her master's to transition into research. So yeah, a lot of, I think folks who come from like that writing, journalism, storytelling background, it's a really neat transition to see.
Do you have any theories as to what is it about research that pulls people in from these different backgrounds?
I think in that case, like there's a easy connection there where journalism folks, they are trying to uncover information. They're trying to understand people. They're trying to tell stories. So that makes sense. I think other folks, like the woman who was working more in technology and then the woman who was working more in design, and same with me, is that you find yourself drawn to the beginning of the process where you're really trying to understand the problem, or you come into a project where you're delivering something where you didn't understand the people or the context, and you've gone through that yourself. And you're really drawn to like, how do I make sure this doesn't happen again? Or how do I learn more about this? And then people kind of stumble into it sometimes.
I've been identifying as a researcher for a long time, and I always felt like, I stumbled into this, but it felt like that was more common because the profession wasn't defined. We didn't have, let's say, the program at Institute of Design that you went through. Like, I don't think that existed.
Mm-hmm.
Or if it did, no one knew about it. So I feel like, I came from this sort of prehistoric era where field was nascent. And so we had to kind of stumble into it.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it was being formed. And it's just fascinating to be many years later, decades later, and programs like yours and so many more. And yet you're characterizing a bunch of people with amazing skills and oriented towards different work and kind of transitioning into this.
Yeah.
It's still what's going on. And I don't know if that may be how careers happen, regardless of what discipline or business you're in. But I guess I always thought it was going to change. And it's just so curious that we still have this happening now in this field.
At least from what I can see, like from the, folks on my team and other folks I've interviewed recently, I think having that other kind of background or perspective gives them an upper hand in some ways because they bring a whole nother set of skills and perspective into the work they're doing. I've just found, just the way that people can craft those stories or the experiences that they can share help build like a bigger picture. Just different perspectives kind of bring them to this work and help them have kind of a point of view around certain things that is very interesting.
I don't know if you're saying this explicitly, but I'm thinking as part of a team, when you have a range of other contexts or other skill sets that people bring in, even more so, even better, because you have some just diversity of frameworks and superpowers.
Yeah, absolutely. It's awesome because, the team can build on each other. They have these different experiences. And right now I'm actually like the next kind of skill set I'm hoping to bring in is somebody who has pretty solid background in mixed methods. So bringing in more of the quantitative, somebody who's done a lot more quantitative work, but still really understands the qualitative approach as well. Because I think that's an area I don't have a lot of expertise in around quantitative research. And so I'm hoping to continue to add to the team in that way.
So just a slight topic shift here and pulling in some of the things that you've talked about when you're kind of giving the story of different roles that you'd had. You described at one point moving into, I think it was at Project 202, like moving into leading a team. And then that being, I think, a defining characteristic of the work you'd been doing then and since then. Research leadership is new-ish, relatively speaking. It was kind of the impetus for me in this podcast. Like, hey, here's kind of a new role that we just didn't have. Again, if you go back a number of years, do you have, a perspective on what research leadership looks like? Is it different than other kinds of leadership? Yeah,
I don't know that it's different than other kinds of leadership. I think there's all the similar aspects, right? You're trying to sort of set a vision of, who you are and what value you provide. You're working with folks who I love being a manager. I love understanding people's goals and their career paths and the things that they're trying to do and figuring out how do we match that with the needs of the organization? How do we help someone sort of grow and get the opportunities that they want at the same time that we're providing, the value that we need to provide to our company? And so that's one of my favorite things. And then thinking about, I guess as a leader, you need to really, again, understand the business, understand and keep in contact with a lot of different folks, know how to grow your team, how to think about, I guess one of the big decisions with research that might be a little bit different, but is similar to things like data science or QA. It's like you can have a centralized team or you can have a distributed team. There's something about how you organize yourself and how you work with parts of the organization that the leader really has to have a vision around that and the kind of, again, I would call it like principles, but like what are the values or principles for how your team is going to operate? So like one of the things we talk about a lot is we don't want anyone to have any barriers to interact with us. So we don't require, somebody to go through a form or put in a request or anything like that. We do office hours. You can ping us on Slack. You can, there's all these different ways that you can interact with us. So I think kind of setting those values for how your group operates is really important.
Given that you're someone who's done research many points in your career, does that influence or help define the way that you approach being a manager for research?
It's a good question. I mean, I think just trying to think about, I don't know if this is a good example, but when we were a little bit over a year ago, like helping figure out what we wanted to do, our goals for the next year, this was actually driven by one of the researchers, Liz. She created a survey and went and did, one-on-one interviews with everybody on the team. So we actually kind of researched the situation that was happening in order to determine, let's say, do we need to provide more education around, writing a discussion guide or something like that. So we kind of used our own approach of research to understand our own situation, come up with ideas and prioritize them. I guess that's that skill of listening and talking to people and being able to analyze a lot of information and synthesize it is a skill set that I find valuable every day. The ability to kind of like take that synthesis and make a plan, organize it, and prioritize things has been very handy as a leader.
So there's an example of superpowers that researchers have that you have, as given your career, that influence and support your management work. Do you have other superpowers or things in your background that maybe that we haven't talked about that you find yourself drawing from?
It's a good question. I don't know if it's from my background or just like my personality or what exactly, but I just say like being able to simplify complexity into really clear communications, whether that's written or, a slide deck or whatever it is something that I've honed over time, right? It's something that I, especially like being a consultant and then, research, like how do you take all this information and how do you put something in front of somebody that they're going to be able to remember, respond to, or, kind of take in. So thinking about that. And then I think too, just like researchers have to have a plan, right? Like you're going in to do research, there's a lot of like logistical things. There's a lot of strategic things too. And I think being able to both think high level and also think, tactically are really important. So, okay, we need to get, in 6 months, we need to understand the answer to this huge question. How are we going to get there? I think researchers, have to figure out how they're going to get to that end goal. Design's the same way, right? You have to kind of break things down into manageable chunks and kind of make this plan. And I think that's a really good skill. Like a lot of people, I don't want to say a lot of people, but I think some people have, visions of something they want to get to, but don't have a way to kind of break it down and figure out how to move to that vision. And I think researchers and designers are skilled in that.
It just makes me wonder, if we sort of go see researchers in their off work lives, like what kinds of life skills would we see or what kinds of applications to some of these researcher strengths would we see in the non-work parts of people's lives? Because I think you're right. And we've talked about things like storytelling and complexity and planning. And do those things manifest, or do we shut those things off? Or are there other things that kind of come to the fore when we're, quote, on the job?
I mean, I guess the other thing I see from a lot of researchers and I love is just their curiosity in other areas. So what obscure thing are they off kind of looking at, reading about, learning about, that they then, take something from and bring it back into their work? Like I always find that fascinating. I think that's what I loved about school, grad school, undergrad, where you're learning about all these different subjects, and all of a sudden you find that something about acupuncture and the philosophy like applies to a design project that you're doing. So I think, having those curiosities and finding those connections are really important.
So there's anything else that you think we should talk about that I didn't ask you about?
I can't think of anything, to be honest. I think that was really fun to share all those different things. I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
Well, I'll throw another one at you then.
Okay.
When you think about whether it's the field or you and your team at Duo, what do you sort of look forward to in the future? Where do you think things are heading? Maybe if we say 5 years, do you have any vision or anticipation for where we might be at that point?
Wow, 5 years is a long time. I don't know. I find those questions really, really challenging. I guess thinking about where my team is at is one thing, or just the field in general. I do see, there's so many evolutions around different aspects of technology that are happening right now that I don't think we quite know how they're going to play out, around like augmented reality and voice assisted technology and all these things that I don't think we've quite embedded in how we do our work. Like, I don't know if there's going to be some different ways of us interacting with people. I mean, just even thinking about the current climate right now, we're trying to figure out how to gain contextual information when we cannot be in context with people. So is there a way to get that kind of closeness or realness with people in a way that is different than being on site with someone, or different than, like a diary study tool or something like that? I don't know what that might look like. So I think that's one thing. I think I'm also, there's a lot of folks who practice like mixed methods. That's still an area that I feel like we still have quite a separation between qualitative and quantitative specialties, and not quite figuring out how to bridge that gap. So that's something that I want to watch for in the future. Like, how do we really take advantage of lots of data that we have access to that could help us make decisions and learn? I'm trying to think what else. I don't know if those are very good answers, but
they're great answers, because my question was a terrible one. It said, what's the future going to be? And you said, well, here's what I'm going to be looking for, which is a good researcher response. Yeah. Here's the signals I'll be paying attention to.
It's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I think research is so needed. I hope that we evolve where we are not, there's kind of like, UX research. And then like my team, we call it design research. There's research that's, in the service of sort of like product UI versus like research that's, much more looking at, the customer journey, the customer life cycle more holistically. And there's a lot of areas that have been developed in other countries, I would say, like in service design aspects in like the UK and Australia and New Zealand, that just aren't quite here in the US. So that's something that, I hope that researchers are included more, or we get that influence in other areas like public works, right? Like government departments that really impact people's lives. Like, I think there's a whole spectrum of things that researchers could have a big impact on that we're just not, those areas just aren't really built up here yet.
So it's a demand issue, not a supply issue.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
This has been very interesting and lots to think about. I just really appreciate you sharing so much about, your own path and all the great work that you've been doing at Duo Security. And thanks again for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Steve. I enjoyed the conversation as always. And look forward to next time we get to catch up.
Thanks for listening. Tell your colleagues about Dollars to Donuts and give us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can find Dollars to Donuts on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Google Play. And all the places where pods are cached. Visit portugal.com/podcast to get all the episodes with show notes and transcripts. And we're on Twitter at Dollars to Donuts. That's DOLLRSTODONUTS. Our theme music is by Bruce Todd.